The bones were all that remained of them, scattered and fused into a rough circle around the dead mouth of a furnace that should never have been built that close to where men met to talk about power and profit. In the records that survived, there are only hints and fragments, nothing that dares to tell the whole story completely, nothing that explains why 14 plantation owners entered a room together one evening in 1716 and never walked back out again. The walls that once heard their voices have long since begun to crumble, the metal is rusting, and the ash has sunk deep into the stone, but the memory of what happened there clings like smoke that refuses to clear. Their names, their land, their titles, their authority over other human beings were supposed to anchor their legacy for centuries, yet they are mostly remembered now for the way they died, in a circle, in the dark, surrounded by iron and heat. Somewhere inside that story, hidden between the silences and the things no one wanted to admit, is a woman whose name almost vanished with the rest of the evidence, a woman called Esperanza de Lima, and to understand how her name became chained to their final hour, we have to walk back through the world that created all of them. If you want to stay with this investigation into one of the darkest and most unsettling stories buried in colonial history, make sure you subscribe, like, comment, and share, so this kind of buried past doesn't disappear again into silence. The world that shaped Esperanza was built on ownership, on ledgers filled with numbers that represented crops and people side by side, as if both were just different forms of property. On the plantations that stretched across the landscape, everything was divided and ranked. There were the owners and their families, who held legal control over land and lives. There were overseers, trusted to enforce order through fear and punishment. There were domestic servants, constantly watched but moving closer to the inner workings of the house. And there were the men, women, and children forced to labor in fields and workshops from before sunrise until after dark, given no say over where they lived, what they did, or whether they lived or died. Punishments were public and brutal. Stories of resistance were quietly buried. In that world, a woman in Esperanza's position was expected to endure, to be invisible when the important men spoke, to pass through rooms without leaving a trace. Yet her name survived, faint and contested, because something happened that no one could afford to leave completely unexplained. In a marginal note in a parish record, someone mentioned a woman connected to the house where the furnace stood, a woman present in the days leading up to the deaths and missing immediately afterward. In later retellings, she appears as a servant moving silently through corridors, as a widow who lost everything at the owner's hands, as an enslaved woman forced to witness cruelty so often that her mind could no longer accept it as normal. None of these versions can be fully proven, and that uncertainty became part of her legend. The less the surviving documents say about her, the more obvious it becomes that someone had reasons not to write too much. The furnace itself was not meant to be a symbol. It began as a tool, part of the industrial backbone of plantation life. Large, brick-lined, and fed with coal, it was designed to reach temperatures so extreme that metal could be shaped, tools could be repaired, machinery could be maintained. Men trusted it because they believed they controlled it. They measured its output, they calculated its costs, and they walked around it with the casual arrogance of people who assumed nothing in their world would ever turn against them. The furnace consumed fuel every day as workers shoveled, stoked, and sweated under the unseen pressure of quotas and threats. It was loud, hot, and dangerous, but it was theirs, just another engine of their wealth. To move safely around such a machine required constant observation. Someone had to learn how the draft changed when the wind shifted, how long the coal took to catch, how much air to allow in through the vents. Someone had to be close enough to feel when the heat was uneven, to hear when the metal inside began to buckle, to know when the fire had grown too wild or too weak. In most stories about Esperanza, this is where she first steps out of the background. She watched the furnace. She learned its moods. Whether she did so as a forced laborer in the workshop, as a servant sent with messages, or as a woman who simply refused to ignore what others dismissed as routine, every version of the tale agrees on one point: she understood that furnace better than the men who believed they owned it. At the same time, the 14 plantation owners developed a habit that would prove to be their undoing. They began using a room connected to the furnace chamber as a private meeting place, a space they considered secure and discreet. Inside those walls, they discussed crop failures and price fluctuations. They debated new rules for controlling the people who worked their land. They shared strategies for punishing runaways and crushing any sign of rebellion. The furnace room, once merely industrial, slowly became a council chamber, a place where decisions were made that would ripple like shockwaves through every cabin and field on the surrounding estates. It is in this overlap, the owners' meetings and Esperanza's knowledge of the furnace, that the story takes its sharpest turn. Some accounts say she lost a child to a punishment ordered by one of those men, a child worked to collapse or whipped for some invented offense. Others say she saw someone she loved sold away to another plantation, their entire life reduced to a number in a ledger. There are whispers that she herself was beaten, humiliated, or threatened with being sent to even harsher conditions in distant lands. Whatever the exact trigger, the legend insists there was a moment when grief, rage, and desperation converged, and she stopped seeing the furnace as just a tool. It became, in her mind, a possibility. She would have needed time. Time to understand not just how hot the furnace could burn, but how to control it in such a way that once those men were inside, there would be no escape. Time to learn which doors could be locked from the outside and which levers could be jammed. Time to memorize the sound of the hinges and the strength of the bolts. Time to watch the rhythms of the meetings. When the men arrived, how long they stayed, who guarded the entrances, who carried messages, who might notice if something was slightly out of place. If the story is true, she did all of this while maintaining the appearance of obedience, while moving quietly enough that those who relied on her presence never stopped to wonder what she might be seeing. The night that matters most began, by all outward signs, like many others. The 14 owners arrived in their usual carriages or on horseback, dust clinging to their boots, the smell of tobacco and rum following them down the hallway. They spoke in low tones about shipments and harvests, about disputes with neighboring estates, about laws being debated that might tighten their grip on the people under their control. They trusted one another enough to meet behind closed doors, but not enough to tell the whole truth about their own financial weaknesses or private fears. Still, inside that room, they believed themselves among equals. No one in that circle imagined that they were stepping into their last discussion. Some accounts say Esperanza greeted them near the entrance, offering water or wine, guiding them toward the chamber with practiced deference. Others say she was not seen at all, that she moved through side passages, ensuring everything was prepared before they arrived. However it happened, the result was the same: the men gathered, the door shut behind them, and they took their places, perhaps without noticing that the furnace had been stoked earlier than usual, that the air already held a faint shimmer of heat. At first, the warmth might have felt harmless, even pleasant compared to the chill outside. They had met there before. They had grown used to it. But as the minutes passed, the balance inside the room shifted. The air grew heavier. Breathing became slightly more difficult. Voices might have risen, not in alarm at first, but in irritation. Someone could have wiped sweat from his brow and complained about the fire being unnecessary. Perhaps one of them banged on the side of the furnace with a fist, shouting for a worker to adjust the vents. Perhaps another laughed it off, saying they were all getting soft, unable to handle a bit of warmth. They had no reason yet to believe that the heat was no longer under their control. The moment of realization, if it came gradually, must have been terrifying in its quiet clarity. A man goes to the door and finds it fastened in a way it usually is not. Another tries the opposite side, expecting a servant to answer, only to find that no one responds. The sound of the fire, once a background roar they barely noticed, now dominates the room. The walls begin to radiate a steady, suffocating energy. The iron fittings and shackles that once seemed like ordinary pieces of equipment begin to glow faintly, promising nothing but pain. Panic does not have to be loud to be real. A few exchanged looks, a tremor in a voice, a fist slamming against unyielding wood, all of it would have signaled that something was wrong. In the aftermath, when searchers finally entered, they would later report what could be seen: bodies reduced to remains, bones twisted and warped, metal fused in places to what used to be human limbs. The circle in which they were found did not look like the result of people collapsing randomly in chaos. It suggested arrangement, intention. The shackles, the positions near the hottest parts of the chamber, the way the exits had been rendered unusable. It all told a story of control exercised by someone who understood both the machine and the men inside it. This scene, rather than any written confession, became the main evidence that what happened was no simple accident. When word spread beyond the immediate estate, the reactions were complicated. Other owners were horrified, not simply by the manner of death, but by the implication that their own tools, their own infrastructure, could be turned against them. They had long feared uprisings in the fields, sudden attacks with whatever weapons could be seized. But this was different. This suggested patience, planning, and an understanding of their routines that made them feel exposed in places they had always considered safe. Fear, for the first time, traveled up the social hierarchy instead of just down. Almost immediately, efforts began to control not just the site, but the story. The furnace was shut down under the pretext of safety. Soon after, it was dismantled piece by piece. Official documents that might have referred to it grew vague or disappeared entirely. Any blueprint, inventory, or receipt that could have tied it to the meeting of those 14 men quieted into generalities. In the public account, if anyone asked, it could be described as an unfortunate accident, a structural failure, a tragic mishap during a routine gathering. To admit otherwise would have meant acknowledging that their authority could be shattered from below. Yet among the people who lived in the surrounding area, especially those whose lives had been ruled by these men, a different version circulated. In that version, the deaths were not random, and the furnace did not fail on its own. Someone had decided their time was over. Someone who had been invisible to them, someone they underestimated so completely that they never imagined she might be capable of orchestrating their end. That someone, the story insisted, was Esperanza de Lima. Her name began to appear in places where officials had no interest in writing it down, in whispered conversations after dark, in songs murmured under breath, in warnings passed from elders to children. Sometimes she was described as a woman who had lost everyone she loved because of the orders given in that very room. Sometimes she was called the one who listened when others wept, the one who counted every lash, every sail, every grave. Sometimes she took on almost supernatural qualities, as if no ordinary person could have done what she did. The few scraps that remain in written form hint that even among the oppressed, opinions about her differed. Some saw her as a figure of terrible justice. Others, still traumatized by the mere thought of that much fire, spoke of her with fear. Over the decades and then centuries that followed, layers of retelling changed the details while preserving the core: 14 owners, one furnace, a locked room, and a woman whose exact role no one could ever completely pin down. Historians who tried to separate fact from legend found themselves with a handful of verifiable points and a vast gulf of uncertainty. Parish notes mention an unusual incident with multiple deaths but stop short of specifics. Estate paperwork shifts suddenly after 1716, as land changes hands and certain family lines thin out faster than recorded causes of death can explain. Somewhere on the edge of one archive, a reference to a missing woman appears and then is never explained. This uncertainty raises a question that sits at the center of any attempt to tell Esperanza's story: who was she, truly? Was she methodical, observant, capable of using the master's own technology against them with cold precision? Was she driven by sudden fury, acting in a moment that escalated far beyond anything she initially intended? Was she a collective invention, a single name given to a whispered fear that those in power tried to bury under safer explanations? Or was she all of these at once, a real person whose memory was reshaped over time by everyone who needed her to mean something different? Looking back from the present, with the benefit of distance but the limitation of incomplete evidence, there is no easy way to label her without also simplifying the world she moved through. If she acted, she did so from a position where every path open to the men who died was closed to her. There were no legal channels that would have listened to her testimony. There were no courts that would have taken her word over theirs. There were no institutions designed to protect her from them. Any attempt to understand her choices must grapple with that fundamental imbalance, the reality that in her world, suffering flowed in one direction for a very long time without consequence for the people who caused it. Yet understanding context does not erase the horror of what happened inside that furnace room. The men who died were capable of inflicting immense harm, but they were still human beings who faced a death that offered no dignity and no escape. The circle of charred remains is not a symbol that neatly resolves into a simple moral. It is a wound, one that forces anyone who looks at it closely to confront questions without straightforward answers. Is an act like this resistance, or is it atrocity? Can it be both? What happens to a society when those at the bottom, denied every other avenue, decide to answer cruelty with something unimaginably worse? Today, when their story is told at all, it is often in hushed tones, in niche corners of historical research, in local folklore, or in modern retellings that try to capture the unease of a narrative that refuses to settle into comfort. Some listeners instinctively cast Esperanza as a hero, finally turning power on those who abused it. Others recoil, seeing only the methodical horror of trapping men in a furnace and ensuring they could never escape. Between these reactions lies the complicated truth. The line between justice and vengeance is rarely as clear in practice as it appears in theory, especially in a world built on systematic dehumanization. What remains undeniable is that on one night in 1716, in a room designed for heat and labor, the usual order collapsed. Men who believed themselves untouchable discovered, too late, that someone had been watching them closely enough to know when and how to strike. A machine they considered harmless in their hands became the instrument of their deaths. And at the center of the story, whether as a living architect of the event or as a figure shaped by collective fear and rage, stands the name that has never quite faded away, Esperanza de Lima. So as you think about what you've just heard, about the circle of ash, the dismantled furnace, the missing records, and the woman whose memory clings to all of it like a shadow, consider what this story says about power, about silence, and about what happens when a person with no recognized voice finds a way to make themselves heard in the most devastating way imaginable. If you want more of these long-form, deeply researched narratives that pull buried histories back into the light, make sure you subscribe, like, comment, and share, so that stories like this are not lost again to the comfortable versions of the past that leave out the people who refuse to stay invisible.